Kupiansk has become the name on everyone's lips again. A city that over the past few years has come to symbolize both hope and heartbreak in Ukraine's struggle for freedom. Tonight, what's happening there is more than just another episode in the long and exhausting war. It's a turning point that could reshape the entire balance on the Eastern Front. But before we get to the heart of the matter, let's take a step back and look at what led to this moment. Because nothing about Kupiansk was ever accidental. Every street, every bridge, every meter of land has been paid for with blood, endurance, and unimaginable courage. For months, Kupiansk was a word whispered in military briefings and debated endlessly among analysts. It stood as a symbol of resilience, a place that refused to fall completely into darkness despite the suffocating pressure from Russian forces. Behind the silence and the cautious words of officials, something enormous was taking shape, a military operation that many thought impossible. Ukrainian defense forces, gathering strength and patience, began the kind of maneuver that would take even seasoned strategists by surprise. And while Moscow was busy boasting about victories that existed only in their own reports, the ground reality was shifting in Kiev's favor. Reports from the Deep State project hinted at a change long before anyone dared to speak openly. They described the northwestern part of Kupiansk being cleared, with Russian units trapped inside the city and cut off from their main forces. But as always, Ukrainian analysts knew that success loves silence, and until the mission was safe to talk about, they kept it under wraps. The operation, as they later revealed, involved the precise coordination of units across multiple branches, from the National Guard's elite Khartia Corps to the Security Services Alpha Group and the Special Forces of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. Even the military police joined in, a sign of how seriously this mission was taken. Together, they created a powerful combined strike group, one capable of reshaping the battlefield in just a matter of weeks. To understand how this came to be, we need to revisit the long and painful history of Kupiansk since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. The city was among the first to fall under occupation in 2022, but Ukrainian forces reclaimed it during the spectacular counteroffensive that liberated much of the Kharkiv region later that year. For a brief moment, hope returned, yet the shadow of war never left. Russian troops, humiliated but unbroken, regrouped and began plotting a return. Their goal was to regain Kupiansk, not only for its strategic value, but for the propaganda victory it would bring to the Kremlin. And for nearly 2 years they tried, again and again, to make that dream a reality. By late 2024, Russian forces had managed to crawl back toward the Oskil River, dividing the Ukrainian bridgehead east of Kupiansk. They pushed with brutal persistence, claiming control over villages and reporting progress that often existed only on paper. Moscow's propaganda channels were full of confident declarations. Kupiansk was surrounded. Kupiansk was about to fall. Kupiansk was theirs. But behind those headlines, the reality was different. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones kept capturing footage that told another story, one of small, disorganized Russian detachments struggling to survive amid relentless artillery fire and precision strikes. And while Russia celebrated imaginary victories, Ukrainian defenders were busy preparing something far greater. A counter-operation that would expose the weaknesses of the Russian front and reveal just how fragile their gains really were. In Kupiansk, the fighting was never about brute force. It was about patience, about timing, and about understanding exactly when to strike. But perhaps what makes this story truly remarkable is not just the tactical brilliance, it's the symbolism. Kupiansk is not just another dot on the map. It represents everything Ukrainians have fought for: independence, dignity, and the right to decide their own future. And as we'll soon see, the events that unfolded here over the past weeks may well go down as one of the defining moments of this war. Before we reveal what happened next, before we speak of the operation that turned the tide and the incredible scenes now emerging from Kupiansk, make sure to stay tuned and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is nothing short of astonishing. This is a story that shows not just military strategy, but the human spirit at its strongest. When you're ready, tell me. Give me the next part. Part 2. The truth about Kupiansk began to surface gradually, as if the fog of war was finally starting to lift. The rumors, the whispers, the scattered posts by military observers, they all started to align into a clear picture. It turned out that the Russian operation, the one they had so proudly announced to the world as a decisive push to liberate Kupiansk, had instead collapsed into one of their most humiliating setbacks since the start of the full-scale invasion. While Moscow's Ministry of Defense boasted of progress and paraded videos of soldiers waving flags in deserted areas, the real battle was being lost in silence. Ukrainian units had methodically cut off Russian supply lines, encircled several isolated enemy groups, and reclaimed almost all of the city's northern sector. What Russian media called an advance was, in reality, a slow-motion retreat. The operation, as detailed later by Ukrainian analysts, was a textbook example of coordination between different branches of defense. Units of the National Guard's Khartia Brigade, along with the armed forces and special operations teams, moved with surgical precision. Their goal was not to rush, not to waste lives on frontal assaults, but to suffocate the enemy step by step, blocking every road, every possible escape, every potential resupply route. By the time the Russians realized what was happening, it was too late. Their communications were in chaos, their morale broken, and their units split into disconnected pockets surrounded by Ukrainian fire. Kupiansk had always been a symbolic point for the Kremlin. When Russian propagandists first claimed to have captured it, Vladimir Putin himself referenced the liberation of Kupiansk in international talks. He praised his generals, smiled before cameras, and assured the Russian public that the city is under full control. But on the ground, the picture was entirely different. The same day he made that statement, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones recorded Russian soldiers trapped in the city center, cut off from their reinforcements. What followed was a slow but relentless clearing operation, one that combined precise artillery strikes, drone warfare, and close-quarters engagements. Ukrainian soldiers advanced building by building, sometimes discovering small Russian groups who had been hiding for days, lost and out of ammunition. Perhaps the most striking moment came when reports confirmed that Russian troops had been using underground communication tunnels, literally crawling through pipelines and maintenance shafts to sneak closer to Ukrainian positions. Videos emerged later showing soldiers pushing small trolleys inside dark tunnels, whispering to each other as they tried to move unnoticed. It sounded absurd, almost surreal, but it reflected the desperation of a force that had lost command structure and control. Ukrainian engineers quickly identified and sealed these underground routes, cutting off the last lifeline for the trapped Russian groups. What had been intended as a clever infiltration plan turned into a logistical nightmare. By October, deep state analysts began publishing detailed situation maps that made one thing clear: the Russian presence in Kupiansk was shrinking fast. In the north and northwest, Ukrainian forces had re-established full control. In the center, small Russian enclaves remained, but they were encircled, deprived of supplies, and constantly under drone observation. Every attempt to reinforce them ended the same way: destroyed convoys, intercepted communications, and demoralized troops. The Russian Ministry of Defense continued to release triumphant statements claiming progress in Kupiansk, but even prominent Russian war bloggers began to express doubts. Yuri Podolyaka, one of Moscow's most followed military commentators, admitted publicly that the so-called operation had failed, blaming the exposure of positions and the impossibility of sustaining hidden routes. Meanwhile, Ukrainian commanders maintained composure. They had learned the hard way that premature celebration could cost lives. Instead of declaring victory too soon, they let the results speak for themselves. Satellite images showed smoke columns rising from Russian positions that no longer existed. Reports from the National Guard confirmed that the northern districts were entirely liberated and that stabilization efforts were underway. The Joint Task Force, made up of the 92nd Assault Brigade, the Khartia Corps, and units from the Defense Intelligence and the SBU, executed what observers later described as one of the most complex urban operations of the war. It wasn't about speed, it was about precision. Then came the moment that changed everything. President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Kupiansk. His visit, recorded on video and published across social media, served as undeniable proof of what Ukraine had achieved. Standing near a freshly cleared checkpoint at the entrance to the city, Zelensky thanked the soldiers, shaking their hands one by one. The location was instantly verified by analysts. It was inside Kupiansk's perimeter, in a place that Russia had claimed to control completely. The symbolism could not have been stronger. While Putin had been boasting about taking Kupiansk, Zelensky was physically standing there, surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers who had just reclaimed it. "We see how it really is," he said. "They spoke much about Kupiansk. We're here now. Our forces are achieving results, and this means Ukraine is moving forward." His words resonated far beyond the front lines. For Ukrainians, the recapture of Kupiansk was not just a tactical success, it was a statement. It proved that Russia's narrative of unstoppable momentum was crumbling. It showed that no amount of propaganda could hide defeat when facts on the ground told another story. And for the Russian leadership, it was a devastating blow. Putin's public confidence began to sound hollow. His earlier declarations replayed endlessly online with mocking commentary. The same state media channels that had once celebrated the liberation of Kupiansk quietly shifted focus to other fronts, avoiding mention of the city altogether. Inside Russia, even loyalist bloggers began to question the competence of the Ministry of Defense. Some accused commanders of falsifying reports, others of sending soldiers into hopeless assaults just to fit the narrative of success. "You can make a mistake," one Z channel wrote, "but you cannot lie to your own country." The illusion of progress had finally cracked. For the first time in months, Russian audiences were forced to confront the possibility that the war was not going as planned, that what they were told on television did not match what was happening in the mud and ruins of Kupiansk. What made the Ukrainian operation so effective was its layered strategy. They didn't just push back the Russians, they dismantled their ability to coordinate. Drones operated almost continuously over the battlefield, tracking every movement. Artillery units, guided by live intelligence, struck with pinpoint accuracy. Electronic warfare teams jammed Russian communications, cutting them off from their command posts. Within days, what had been an organized offensive turned into chaos. Soldiers fled in small groups, leaving behind ammunition, vehicles, and even maps. By the end of November, Ukrainian units controlled the city almost entirely, and cleanup operations began to remove unexploded ordnance and restore electricity. But perhaps the greatest impact of Kupiansk's liberation wasn't on the battlefield at all. It was psychological. For months, Kremlin officials had been feeding the narrative that Russia was advancing steadily, that every setback was temporary, that victory was inevitable. Kupiansk shattered that illusion. It reminded everyone watching that Ukraine was still capable of surprise, that its defenders were far from broken, and that Russia's war machine could be stopped. Yet this story doesn't end here. What happened after Kupiansk's liberation? How this single event changed the dynamics on multiple fronts, and what it revealed about the future of this war? All of that deserves a closer look. Because the aftermath of this victory holds secrets, decisions, and consequences that go far beyond one city. The next part will dive deep into the expanded impact, political, military, and psychological, that this moment unleashed. When you're ready, tell me, give me the next part. Part 3. After the liberation of Kupiansk, Ukraine entered a new phase of the war, one that was not only about reclaiming land, but about redefining power, morale, and the narrative of the entire conflict. The echoes of victory in Kupiansk spread far beyond the borders of the Kharkiv region. They reached Brussels, Washington, Berlin, and London. International media outlets began broadcasting the news, showing footage of Ukrainian soldiers raising the national flag once again over the city that had become a symbol of resistance. The images contrasted sharply with the silence coming from Moscow. Russian officials, who had just days earlier proclaimed the final liberation of Kupiansk, suddenly found themselves without words. The Kremlin's propaganda machine went into overdrive, attempting to reshape the story, but it was too late. The world had already seen what had happened. Ukraine had turned the tide. Military experts began analyzing the operation, describing it as one of the most precise urban campaigns of the war. Kupiansk had been turned into a fortress by Russian forces, filled with mines, traps and barricades, yet Ukrainian troops managed to retake it with calculated efficiency. Intelligence cooperation between the Defense Intelligence Directorate, the SBU, and the armed forces was credited for the success. Real-time drone reconnaissance allowed command units to make split-second adjustments, neutralizing Russian firing points before they could react. It was a demonstration not just of courage, but of technological superiority. Every movement was tracked, every target identified, every escape route closed. When Ukrainian ground units finally moved in to clear the last enemy strongholds, they faced an enemy already exhausted, disoriented, and demoralized. The aftermath in the city was devastating to witness. Entire districts lay in ruins. Schools, residential blocks, and hospitals bore the marks of relentless shelling. Civilians who had lived through months of occupation described the fear, the rationing, and the constant uncertainty. Some spoke of Russian soldiers looting stores and homes, others of civilians forced to hide in basements for weeks without electricity or clean water. But amid the destruction, there was also relief, the kind of collective breath that a city takes when it realizes it has survived. Ukrainian engineers immediately began clearing mines and restoring communication lines, while local authorities started organizing humanitarian aid convoys. Volunteers arrived with food and medical supplies, while international partners pledged reconstruction support. Kupiansk, once again, was becoming a place of life, not despair. Politically, the liberation of Kupiansk changed everything. It disrupted Russia's narrative of steady, unstoppable progress and gave Ukraine a renewed position of strength in diplomatic talks. In Kiev, President Zelensky convened meetings with his top military and intelligence commanders to discuss the next steps. According to reports, the atmosphere was confident but measured. Everyone understood that Kupiansk was not the end. It was the beginning of a larger counterbalance. Ukrainian analysts from the Center for Defense Strategies noted that the operation had exposed the structural weaknesses in the Russian command system, particularly in the Zapad and Sever groupings, responsible for operations in the Kharkiv and Luhansk regions. Poor communication, lack of unified leadership, and the constant need to fabricate reports for Moscow had crippled their effectiveness. Kupiansk had been the breaking point where these flaws became impossible to hide. In Russia, the consequences were immediate. Prominent Z channels, which once served as cheerleaders for the war effort, began turning against the Ministry of Defense. Some accused generals of lying to the president. Others openly mocked the state television anchors who had celebrated victory in Kupiansk just days earlier. One commentator wrote, "Our soldiers are dying for illusions. The truth is lost somewhere between the trenches and the Kremlin." The tension within Russia's military circles deepened. Internal sources spoke of resignations and investigations, of disputes between commanders over who was responsible for the collapse. Even within the propaganda apparatus, cracks began to appear. Journalists who had built their reputations on patriotic narratives were quietly told to redirect attention to other fronts. Kupiansk became the subject no one in Moscow wanted to discuss. For Ukraine, however, it became a rallying point, proof that discipline, planning, and resilience could overcome even the most entrenched positions. Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk was followed by statements from key Western allies, praising the country's endurance and capability. NATO officials highlighted the success as a case study in modern warfare, showing how flexibility and technological integration could outperform sheer numbers. Military academies across Europe began analyzing the Kupiansk operation as an example of hybrid warfare, combining cyber, drone, and ground operations under unified command. Western defense ministries quietly accelerated deliveries of ammunition and air defense systems to support the momentum Ukraine had regained. But the psychological dimension of Kupiansk's liberation may have been even more powerful than the strategic one. Across Ukraine, the news reignited a sense of hope. Cities far from the front, Kiev, Lviv, Dnipro, Odessa, erupted in spontaneous celebrations as people saw the footage of Ukrainian troops reclaiming streets once filled with enemy patrols. Social media exploded with gratitude toward the soldiers, with posts and videos spreading faster than any state announcement. Even after years of brutal war, after months of exhaustion and grief, people were reminded of something crucial. Victory was still possible. The resilience of Kupiansk became a symbol for the entire nation, a message that perseverance, even in the darkest times, can yield results. Strategically, the liberation had far-reaching consequences for the entire Eastern Front. With Kupiansk secured, Ukrainian forces gained control over vital logistics routes that connected northern Kharkiv with the eastern sectors of the Oskil line. This severely disrupted Russian supply chains running from Svatove and Kreminna. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War noted that this shift forced Russian commanders to reroute supplies through longer, more vulnerable corridors. It also allowed Ukraine to reposition artillery and drone units for future operations aimed at further pushing the front eastward. In essence, Kupiansk became not just a reclaimed city, but a launchpad for continued offensive actions. Meanwhile, Moscow struggled to contain the narrative collapse. Putin, who had personally claimed victory over Kupiansk during a summit in Bishkek, now avoided the topic altogether. Kremlin spokespersons offered vague statements about regrouping operations, while Russian state TV reduced coverage of the Kharkiv region to a minimum. Instead, the focus shifted to minor skirmishes elsewhere, framed as localized successes. But even among loyal viewers, skepticism was growing. People began questioning how a city declared fully under control could suddenly be described as under ongoing operations. The contradictions were too obvious to ignore. Within military forums and telegram discussions, phrases like Kupiansk syndrome began appearing, shorthand for overconfidence followed by humiliation. Internationally, the liberation of Kupiansk was interpreted as a signal that Ukraine's defensive strategies had matured. Western military experts pointed out that the operation demonstrated the effectiveness of long-range precision weapons and drone-based intelligence supplied by allies. It validated the strategy of gradual exhaustion, wearing down Russian forces through precision and patience rather than massive frontal assaults. The success also influenced political conversations abroad. In Washington, policymakers used Kupiansk as an argument for sustaining aid packages, emphasizing that Ukraine could achieve tangible results when properly equipped. In Europe, leaders who had been hesitant about additional funding found new motivation to support Kiev's military resilience. Yet, beyond strategy and politics, the human cost remained immense. Ukrainian medics worked tirelessly to treat wounded soldiers and civilians, while deminers risked their lives clearing the outskirts of explosives. Families returned cautiously to their homes, often finding them reduced to rubble. The city's central hospital, damaged multiple times, became a symbol of survival, its staff refusing to abandon patients even when shells were falling nearby. And still, despite the destruction, the Ukrainian flag once again fluttered above the Kupiansk city administration building. It was more than a piece of fabric. It was a declaration that occupation and fear would never be permanent. As weeks passed, Kupiansk slowly began to rebuild. Street by street, life returned. Shops reopened, children resumed classes in temporary facilities, and volunteers helped repair roofs and windows. Every act of restoration carried symbolic weight. For many Ukrainians, Kupiansk became a microcosm of the entire country's struggle, wounded but unbroken, scarred but standing. In Kiev, commentators described it as the point where despair turned into defiance. Artists began creating murals depicting the city's defenders, while documentaries were produced to capture the story of its liberation. In the eyes of many, Kupiansk was not just a city, but a testament to what unity and determination could achieve against overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, the repercussions inside Russia continued to ripple. Disillusionment grew among soldiers and their families. Stories leaked of units abandoned without orders, of commanders disappearing during the chaos, of soldiers forced to surrender or flee through forests. The Ministry of Defense responded with silence, but the truth was impossible to hide. Families began demanding answers, and even loyal state journalists were finding it difficult to ignore the growing frustration. Kupiansk, once seen as a minor front, had become a symbol of how misinformation and arrogance could destroy an entire operation. As winter approached, military experts warned that Russia would likely attempt to reclaim lost ground, but few believed they could replicate the scale of their earlier offensives. Ukraine's defenses had grown stronger, its command structure more agile, and its international backing firmer than ever. Kupiansk had shown what could happen when strategy, intelligence, and bravery align perfectly. It had shown that even the strongest narratives of inevitability can crumble when met with truth and perseverance. The fall of Kupiansk to Ukraine's forces wasn't just a battlefield victory. It was a message, one that echoed across continents. It told the world that Ukraine was not merely